Please welcome your moderator, Edward Luce, and panelists for Minding the Gap.
Good evening. Great pleasure to be here. It's fourth year, as Ivo and Gillian said earlier. It's my fourth year, and every year I'm reminded about what a fantastic city Chicago is, apart from anything else. And I think Ivo and the Council, Chicago Council on Global Affairs, have done a brilliant job of putting Chicago on the map, and the Council in particular, as this being the venue for this rising topic of rising global cities. So congratulations to them. You'll be pleased to hear that for the next 50 minutes or so, we're not going to mention Donald Trump. And as a journalist based in Washington, this is a very refreshing contrast to talk about something meaty and substantive and cross-border. Those of you, which I imagine is most of you or many of you that have traveled on the London Underground, will be familiar with that robotic voice. Please mind the gap. Mind the gap. Stand clear of the doors, please. And Minding the Gap is the title of what we're going to be discussing this evening. And really, in terms of the urban gap, there's two that I'd like to talk about. The first is between cities and everywhere else. So nobody can have covered or followed politics in the West in the last few years without noticing this great political divergence between the city and the hinterlands, or much of the electorates in the hinterlands of the nation states that the cities are in. And that's making it very, very hard. Marvin, who's from Bristol, the mayor of Bristol, knows that cities were vetoed, essentially, by the rest of the British electorate in the Brexit referendum. We have a similar story here with the election of he who shall not be named. So that's one gap. It's really a political gap between these economically vibrant cities and the rest. The other is within cities, the inequality gap, which I think we're going to focus on first. And we've got a brilliant panel to do that with. Marvin Rees, as I mentioned, is mayor of Bristol, one of Britain's most vibrant second-tier cities. I think it's fair to call you second-tier. Everywhere that isn't London is second-tier.
I'll let you get away with that at the start.
And I believe the first black Afro-Caribbean mayor of any major European city, second-tier or first-tier. Next to Marvin is Judge Ahluwalia, who I've known for many years, who is head of ICRIA, the Indian Council for Research into International Economic Affairs, and who is a great authority on many things Indian and beyond, including urbanization. And you've written a book about the challenge of urbanization in India, and so we'd love to get into that a little bit too. Next to Isha is Jozias van Aartsen, who is the acting mayor of Amsterdam, former elected mayor of The Hague for 8-9 years, I believe, a figure of Dutch national politics, European politics, so of all levels of government. Helene, Gayle, penultimately, is former head of CARE, which I think is the largest humanitarian organization, one of them.
One of the, yeah.
Formerly at the Center for Disease in Atlanta, now head of the Chicago Community Trust here in Chicago. And finally, Michael Berkowitz, who's head of 100 Resilient Cities of the Rockefeller Foundation. You were, I believe, head of global risk operations at Deutsche Bank. And before that, New York Emergency Response. And correct me if I'm wrong, or add to the list, West Nile virus, 9/11, Flight 111, anthrax. So you're aware of the importance of resilience. Let me start with you, Helene, because we're here in Chicago. You're based in Chicago. We're in the Loop. We're in downtown, thriving urban Chicago. And yet just a few miles away on the south side and the west side, you've got people with life expectancy 13 years lower 13 years lower.
Actually, 16.
16 years lower. 16 years lower, my goodness, than the average within the Loop in downtown and northern Chicago. Is it possible to have a vibrant city without racial integration?
Yeah, well, thanks. And I will reiterate that what you started with, that Chicago is a great city. And I came here about 8 months ago because I believe it's an incredible city and that it has incredible potential as a city. But to your point, I think its full potential is not being realized because of these huge inequalities and these huge gaps. You know, and I think that when you look at it, and we just supported a study that came out from the Metropolitan Planning Council here that looked at the impact that segregation has had on this city. And Chicago, like many urban cities, have a long-standing history of racial and ethnic segregation. But Chicago has had a particular history that has been deep and entrenched. And as a result of that, we see huge inequities. You mentioned the health inequity and the fact that here in this gleaming downtown Loop area, the life expectancy is 85, but you go to parts of west and south side of Chicago, life expectancy is 69 under 70. And so, you know, huge gap. If you look at education, educational attainment, unemployment, you can go on and on and on. And the study that I mentioned, you know, demonstrated, or at least the analysis suggests that with less segregation in the city, the economic growth would be would be much higher, up to $4 billion more in the national the city
income
production, the decrease in homicide by 30%, and again on and on and on. And so I think some of these factors are holding the city back from realizing its full potential, even in this incredible city that continues to have economic growth, but is growing at a much slower pace than it would otherwise.
In a very lopsided way. I mean, just quickly, I mean, if this was Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew were in charge and it weren't really a democracy, you could sort of enforce mixed areas, you could mix people up. That's not possible in a democracy, it's not possible in this system. What are the solutions?
Yeah, well, and you know, it is not necessarily mixing people up, it is giving communities the ability to realize their potential. And yes, you know, mixing, if you will, might have an impact, but I think it's really looking at what are some of the systemic barriers, what are the systematic barriers that hold people back, that don't allow people to have access to high quality education, access to high quality jobs that lead to a long-term employment pathway, access to safe communities, transportation that allows people to get to those jobs. So I think, yeah, it's really looking at what are some of these barriers and how do you actually help to overcome those.
And I want to get back to how you overcome those in a moment. Marvin, you're benefiting from the perhaps sort of dubious glow in Bristol of being essentially an extension of the London property market. And you are one of the fastest gentrifying, that very loaded word, gentrifying cities in Britain, I believe, which means your property prices are galloping. Talk to us a little bit about what it's like to be mayor of a city that's experiencing this, because clearly it's a sign of success, but gentrification is not an unmixed blessing, is it?
No, and it's when we heard earlier on in our session, it's just about that. People can be excluded from the economy and excluded from jobs. I mean, I'd make the distinction between integration and inclusion, actually. Right. As I'm a mixed race man, I'm all for racial integration, but that's not the aim. The aim is inclusion, and then we build relationships from positions of equality, not because we do some cultural, have some cultural curiosity. But yeah, I mean, it's a massive challenge for my city, and one of the things that we point out is that, again, even when developers want to come in and build homes and have no affordable in that unit. That's not a neutral act. That costs the city money, because we end up spending money on public services to cope with the consequences of concentrations of poverty and deprivation, kids being moved from schools, families being moved around, unsettled communities, which are communities of low resilience. We spend money dealing with the consequences of that. So it really puts housing and stable, balanced communities at the heart of our policy approach to the city.
So, Jozias, in the Netherlands, you used to be, until not that long ago, almost a poster child of multicultural success. And things have gone a little bit wrong there, as they have in most places in the last few years. Whether we're talking about inclusion or integration, what could the Dutch be doing better on, and what should others be doing better about bringing people into the cities that they've moved to?
Well, I think it's exactly what Marvin says. It is about inclusion. And in fact, it's not my favorite subject, but we didn't manage it in the right way. When we got a lot from Morocco and Turkey in the 60s and 70s, the Netherlands thought, well, they will stay for a short period and then they will go back to their countries. And we are a tolerant country and a libertarian country, so they can speak their own language, they can have their own culture, but that was in fact a mistake. They stayed. And nowadays, even in the third generation, you can get people from Turkish or Moroccan or whatever descent not speaking the language. And one of the mistakes we made is not learning them obligatory the language. We thought, no, that's not necessary. And well, that led to enormous problems nowadays as well. And I said it this morning during the interesting discussion we had on the leadership of Ivo. I admired Germany enormously, because there you have to learn if you're coming to the country, and they had a lot over the periods of 15, 16, they had to learn the language. In the Netherlands, it's still the case, and that's the national government who said that will be our policy. Still the case that you have to pay for your language courses yourself, and then need a loan, and you have to pay it back after you're more or less integrated or included in society. And that's the wrong policy in my view. So the cities in the Netherlands, The Hague, Amsterdam, well, they are the ones who now try to educate those who don't really know the language. And of course, in the end, it's important that they have jobs and etc.
Indeed.
So we have a fascinating house of skills in Amsterdam, where people who more or less learn the language, but who you try to give them learning practice in practical jobs.
So you see Germany as a little bit of a model in that regard. Isha, I mean, there are plenty of social exclusions in India, and I know that caste doesn't disappear when people leave the village and go to the city, but you can't go to any Indian city without seeing the extraordinary, glaring sort of economic mismatch. And I mean, I think of one example, seeing that the home of Mukesh Ambani, India's richest man, head of Reliance in Mumbai, with 5 helipads, underground parking for 600 guests. A few miles away, you have Dharavi, what was then Asia's largest slum. This kind of disparity doesn't seem to be being addressed with any kind of urgency. And I know there's been political backlashes. You had the Aam Aadmi Party, the Common Man Party, emerge from nowhere, knock the BJP out, knock Congress out, and take power in Delhi. But you don't really see any sort of sustainable efforts to bridge these gaps in India. Am I wrong? Am I being too cynical?
No, I think you are right. And inequality has increased, although we don't have firm numbers about that. I'm quite happy to admit that, yes, inequality has increased. But what is different is that because India has, for the first time, seen very rapid growth for about 20 years, we have got a whole lot of people rise out of poverty and come into the middle class. So our focus for a long time was on abolishing poverty, and as growth happened, in the process, some people became very rich, many people were lifted out of poverty, and what is most important for inclusion today are two things. One is that aspirations are rising faster than incomes, and therefore some of this sensitivity that why can't we get out there and get jobs. And the second problem with respect to inclusion is that growth has not been employment generating. So when people come from rural areas to urban areas, they come with expectations of getting jobs in high productivity, industry or services sector. Those jobs have not been there, not in adequate amounts, and as a result, you have that insecurity, that restlessness, which you see in our cities, and as the population of cities increases, even though even today, India has just about 35 or 36% of our population that is urban, which is very low compared to most other countries, but we are not able to handle public service delivery in our cities, even for this bit of increase. So the need for planned urbanization is very, very urgent.
And I want to get into a little bit later what Narendra Modi, your Prime Minister, means by smart cities when he's talking about building 100 smart cities. But Michael, I mean, you're the sort of urban expert, the sort of generalist here. Pull some of this together. We're talking about very diverse cities in different continents with very different problems. But all of them have the same generic problem of having a gap to mind, a pretty big gap to mind, whether that be social, economic, usually both. What is it that, which cities are doing this well that can be picked up and applied to cities in very different contexts? Which are the cities you see as, and please don't mention Singapore because everybody's bored of hearing about Singapore. Other than Singapore.
Other than Singapore. So, I mean, I think just to level set a little bit, the reason why you have someone who is involved in something called 100 Resilient Cities on this panel is that when we talk about resilience, we talk about a city's ability to survive disaster. And that is a capacity that many people associate with infrastructure, but is really also about good governance. It's about how cities help meet basic needs of their citizens. It's about community cohesion where neighbors check on neighbors. And it's about equity and inclusion. All of those give cities the ability to survive and thrive in the face of whatever the disaster is, whether it's a climate disaster or something else. And if you think about New Orleans and the Katrina story, that story is as much about how warm the Gulf of Mexico was, how big the storm Katrina was, how the infrastructure failed, but it was also about the isolation and desperation in the Lower Ninth Ward. It was about endemic racism. It was about lack of opportunity, and it was about corrupt institutions. All of that contributed as much to the misery post-Katrina as the storm did itself. It's not a rhetorical device to say that these two things, say climate risk and equity, are inextricably linked. And so that's really a part of the risk profile. And then to bring it all together, I think just responding a little bit to what we've heard so far, you talk about isolation and not being able to mix people forcibly like a housing policy in Singapore might have done. But you can also create, through the built environment and through the programs that Helene talked about, the ways in which they can mix. And I would actually say the Dutch are doing it quite well. The Dutch have been recognized as experts in water policy and water management and building infrastructure. But lots of Dutch water management infrastructure these days has social infrastructure components. It's dikes and levees that have parks. It's water plazas in the heart of some of the most vulnerable areas that can capture additional rainwater runoff, but then serve as five-a-side football pitch and a community theater and all these things. It's how cities actually integrate these interventions. We're going to spend $2 trillion a year building urban infrastructure for the next 25, 30 years. We better make it work for equity as much as it works for mobility or climate change or whatever those things are.
So let's talk about something more specific, property prices. I don't think there's any better expression of the gap between those with means and those without means in any city, whether we're talking about Delhi, Amsterdam, Bristol, Chicago, or New York, than the value of property prices. And it's not just the high-end local property prices, it's the fact that you've got global sovereign wealth funds and you've got big hedge funds like BlackRock pouring more and more money into high-end property portfolios so that those property prices begin to track global asset prices rather than local economic conditions. So, Marvin, you are, as I say, in property terms in Bristol, pretty much sort of experiencing London or close to London prices nowadays. How, as a mayor, what practical things can you do to sort of overcome some of that sky-high unaffordability that a lot of people are experiencing?
Well, I mean, there is something about the framing of housing, actually, that we could look at, and I'll talk about that. But in the UK, we think health is a public good that should be accessible to anyone, free at the point of delivery. We think of the same with education. Maybe there's time to think about housing in terms of that, not a commodity to be bought and sold, but actually as an essential public good that must be supplied, because if we get it wrong, nothing else works. Education doesn't work, population health doesn't work, society is fragile, so maybe there's a reframing of that. And in the UK, as you'll know, houses are now pensions, because pensions ain't working. So it's in some sense product and driver of a wider social dysfunction. But in my city, there's some very basic needs. We haven't built enough houses since the 80s. A lot of the public housing stock got sold off. We didn't build them. So I've given one of my cabinet members, his job is just to build houses. That is it. Don't think about anything else. Just get houses built. And we've set some very hard targets. We are quite large landowners in Bristol. The local government owns a lot of land, which has been undeveloped, ironically. But now we are inviting people and just making that declaration that we want to get houses built and we have some hard targets has meant that developers have come forward to start looking at trying to build on our land. But we've been clear on the percentage of affordable. We have a target of 40%. To be honest, we don't reach that. We go for 20 quite often as well. But what we're also clear on is because we are such large landowners, and I've said this to some developers, if you come into my city and you want to build on our land, I'm going to look at your record. I'm going to look at what you do on the land over which we have no control. And if you don't have a track record of delivering affordable, then Bristol, which is a very attractive city for developers, you'll get one hit. But if you want to go on a 10-year journey with us in a fantastic city to develop in, then deliver, and the reward will be a 10-year journey. But we're looking at other models as well. So we've got social developers coming forward. We've got self-builds coming forward. So we're looking at the whole mix. And we're also looking at the way we allocate housing, so public housing. It used to be the way you get a public house is turn up at local government and tell everyone how crap your life is. And then you get a house. One is, it's not a good relationship to have with someone. It's a deficit model of development and running a place rather than an asset model. But what we want to do is be very intentional about how we allocate housing. Actually, so we build the kind of communities that Michael talks about. Balanced communities, mixed communities, not with concentrations of deprivation in some areas and concentrations of wealth in others. So we get very intentional about the way we put a place together without going too much Singapore on you, but having a firm idea with a sense of the financial benefits that brings to the city of actually delivering on that. But I've only been elected 2 years, so I'm not saying we got all the answers. We just have a sense of what we need to be pursuing.
In a minute, I'm just going to bring you in, but I just quickly want to ask you, Michael, without having, and particularly in New York and London, but without having beneficial ownership declared so that you can know who the ultimate owner of a property is, without having a very different non-domicile situation, are you going to be able to tackle this problem?
Yeah, I think the national environments in which these cities are operating. We're going to spend the next 3 days talking about how cities are this great incubator and experimenter and exporter of best practice and how they learn from each other and how cities are more and more important and maybe national governments are less important. But in this area, a lot of this is often national level policy. And so that's where you see this conflicting with national level policy. And cities are really struggling to understand how they improve themselves in an environment like the US and not suffer the consequences of gentrification. I think that is, I mean, they have some levers around policy, around rent control. Some cities are experimenting with something, tax caps, right? Experimenting with community housing subsidies for workers like firemen, policemen, teachers, and so on to try to retain that middle class. But we've also seen, you know, a lot of communities really afraid of what happens when you improve those communities. There's an interesting story about the cleanup of the Anacostia in Washington, D.C., of the Anacostia River, which is polluted, which is a major flood risk, which will deteriorate over time with climate change. And yet the local communities who have the most to gain from it are fearful because they're afraid it will lead to gentrification.
Yeah, I mean, imagine that is a problem you would like to have in India. I mean, that's further down the line. The Yamuna needs cleaning up too. What is the smart city solution to all of this? To affordable housing for the common citizen?
First of all, nobody really knows exactly what is meant by a smart city. So let me share a definition of smart city that I extracted out of the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, the smartest city in the world. In an audience like this, a hall full of people, when he was complimenting the government of India on the smart cities mission 3 years ago, and he said India should have not 100 smart cities, but 1,000 smart cities. And I said to him, pray, what is your understanding of a smart city? And this is what he said. He said, when the people of a city, when the residents of a city demand better public services, and the government, with the help of administrative reform and technology, delivers these services in a transparent and accountable manner, to me, that is a smart city. Now, our smart cities mission that we have actually depends on technology to deliver smart solutions. And it has not really paid enough attention to the need to reform the institutions in which that technology is going to be located. Let me just give you one example of what I consider a smart city in India. And that is a city probably none of you would have heard of. It's a city called Magarpatta, which is outside of Pune. Pune is the second largest city of Maharashtra. Magarpatta was developed by 120 farming families that came together to form a development company in 1993 when they learned that land use was going to change and urbanization was going to come to their place. It's 400 acres, and today it is the smartest city of all in India. It's a green city. It manages all its solid waste in the right way, the only city to do that. It has its wastewater treatment. It has green spaces as you would like. It has unpolluted air. Magarpatta, you can look up the net.
Magarpatta, I've memorized it. It comes before Singapore in my memory now. And it's also a startup city, not just a smart city.
Yes, yes.
Now, one of the problems cities face, and I'm going to get onto the sort of bigger politics, but one of the problems that they face is they're not getting much help from national governments. So you've got, and I want both of you to talk about this, but Helene, first you've got all these federal departments like HUD in Washington, the Housing and Urban Development Department, headed by people who don't believe in their mission. What kind of a challenge is that posing for places like Chicago and the kind of work that you do?
Well, you know, because we're a private entity, we're not dependent, and we're a philanthropy, so we're not dependent on government funding per se, but clearly to be able to do a lot of the things that we would want to do, government cooperation is incredibly important. You know, I do think, to the theme of this whole conference, it's why I think that focusing on what cities can do is incredibly important, because I think there are times where we may not have the kind of support, both financial as well as policy, from the national level to be able to get some of the things done. And that's where I think innovation at the municipal level is so important. But I also think it's a time when we start thinking about how do you bring not just government sector, but the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, philanthropic sector together to find solutions. Because I think this is a time where we're going to start finding these kinds of partnerships across sectors that we might not have done when we're reliant, when we could rely on federal funding, federal policies. So I think there's real opportunity for innovation in how we do the kinds of social change that needs to happen.
Okay, and hopefully we'll get back a little bit more in questions into that theme. Jozias,
but I will just say, and while you know it may be hard during this time, I like the notion when you talked about smart cities that part of this is also about how citizens hold their governments accountable. And I also think this is a time where we need to think about how are we making sure that we're saying what is most important for us as citizens as well.
Now, I mean, Holland's kind of different to the United States or to India. You're compact and you're highly urbanized, so maybe you don't have quite the same divide between national government outlooks and urban governance. But you've worn both hats, and you've been in the European Commission as well. You've been at multiple layers of government. What do you think that is lacking in terms of how cities use national governments and what national governments can do to help cities overcome the kinds of problems we're discussing here?
One of the problems for Dutch cities is that we hardly have our own tax system. Income tax for cities in the Netherlands is about 6 or 7 or sometimes 8% of the income of cities and the way they can spend their money, and the rest comes from the central government or for some sectors from the provincial government. And if you look at Europe, well, the average is more or less 35 or 30% for cities who can earn their own income by leveling taxes. So that's a problem for Dutch cities, and we, for a long time already, we plea in the direction of the national government that should change, without the risk of higher income tax, and because that's always a difficult problem. So you have to balance taxes. And the strange thing, of course, is I think Ivo Daalder mentioned it. The Dutch Republic in the golden age of the Netherlands was built on cities. And that has changed. We have, since the beginning of the 19th century, a central, more or less decentralized, but a central government which is quite strong. And I think we are now on the edge of changing that, and I think we should do that. And that will be an interesting discussion in the Netherlands between the national government and especially the larger cities.
You were, of course, part of the Hanseatic League. Let me, because I know I'm getting sort of violent hand signals off stage about timing, so I want to squeeze a question. They're probably not, I'm being really unfair. I want to squeeze a question in about the larger politics of this. You know, if you think of any nation state and its political culture, when they talk about what their real country is, they always have, and of course the word real is highly contestable, but they always have a rural image. You know, when you have the Ghanaian village and the homespun cotton as being the idea of India, in Britain it's, you know, some home counties village with thatched cottages and Frisian cows. I'm sure there's some windmills in your vision. And in America, there are cornfields and small towns. Cities are, you know, increasingly, as I said at the beginning, being vetoed in terms of their political preference for national governments by people who don't live in them. What can cities do to be more loved in the national imagination, and therefore to have more leverage over the national direction And this is a very open-ended question, but I think it's not a frivolous one. I think it's a pretty important question facing all cities, and the same applies to India. Let's just go around each of you, and then, because of the non-violent, very gentle hand signals, we will then move quickly to audience questions. Michael.
I think the reality is that cities will never have enough. They never will control their own destiny. And so they will always need to work in coalition using formal power and soft power and build coalitions, whether that's with the suburbs or with private sector or civil society, as Helene mentioned, or with the exurbs beyond. Those are all the elements. You think about New York, as I was saying earlier, $90 billion annual budget, controls their own water from the reservoir to the tap, their own schools, 250,000 employees, and yet many of the factors that make New York livable, equitable, sustainable, resilient are beyond the mayor's control. And so what can cities do to ingratiate themselves? They can work more collaboratively with their neighbors, whether those are surrounding counties or states or beyond.
So how does Chicago seduce Illinois?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, it's starting to break down some of our urban-rural silos and actually get to know each other and what are people living with. And I think that, as you mentioned, in several of the political scenarios, they evolved because people were out of touch with what was going on in the middle of their countries. And so I think that we can all do a lot more to get to understand what the issues are, and then think about where are there opportunities for working in more complementary and coordinated fashions, and in ways that there's some mutual win-wins. Clearly, in this region, it is important for Chicago to see itself as part of the broader region. There's a lot of industry, there's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of economic growth that happens outside of the city of Chicago. And I think by being better about figuring out how to integrate the region, economic growth and all that can come with that will be much greater than only thinking about what's in the bounds of the metropolitan area. So I think there's a lot of advantage in thinking about how do we actually look at some of those win-win situations and break down some of those silos.
Interesting. What about the Netherlands?
Difficult question. There is some tendency in the Netherlands, it's not a lucky tendency, to be quite critical about the cities, especially Amsterdam. Because many in the Netherlands think it's a strange city, libertarian city, and spending a lot of money. So there is a tendency to be quite critical, not really helpful. We have a big discussion at the moment for the police force and the capacity, more capacity for the police force, important for security in the city of Amsterdam. And it's quite difficult to get a real ear that listens to you. Maybe the best thing in the Netherlands to change our electoral system.
Isha, whatever you say about Modi, he is actually a pro-urban prime minister, right?
In the way in which he talks, and in the way in which he has put out some campaigns for the urban areas. But in fact, if you look at the politics of the situation, India is essentially a two-tier federal setup. And cities are the creatures of the state government. If the census says that between two 10-year census outcomes, you have had 2,700 areas that should be declared as towns, actually only 250 were declared between 2001 and 2011, and the other 2,500 were orphaned towns, which do not have a city government. And if you talk to chief ministers, they will say that these guys don't want to become cities because there is more money in being rural, because a whole lot of central programs are there, And second, if they were to become city governments, there'll be more regulation from the center and the state government, so they don't want to be cities.
The idea of Britain doesn't seem to have kept up with the pace of urbanization. How do you crack this and be relatively efficient? Because I've been inefficient with time here. So if you could compress your answer.
Yeah, I think the world's moved on, and the model of governance we have, both nationally and internationally, has not kept pace with the way people are today. I'm a British, I'm Bristolian. My family are Jamaicans as well, right? The Jamaicans that come and live here, they are Swiss, you know. We are a global family, and governance needs to catch up with that. I mean, on the point that you made, though, about how do we court, if I heard it right, how do we court people around us? Part of me thinks, I'm not interested in courting them. It's nice if they come along, but actually, I can't wait for the rural areas of the UK to catch up with where cities need to be. There's this line by Martin Luther King that talks about power. It says power doesn't come neatly wrapped in government parcels. It's a social force that's there when you get organized. And so there's a piece of me that says, whatever national governments think, and I'm privileged, I'm in the UK, so it's safe for me to say that, I'm not going to get arrested. But whatever national governments think, whatever other governments think, actually, just as a collection of cities, not just within the nation, but globally, we just need to be better organized and better connected. And if we do, we will exercise that influence. And just very briefly, so in the 2 years that since we voted Brexit, not once has David Davis, our Brexit secretary, come to the core cities, the 10 biggest cities outside London, and said, what do you need from the negotiations? Which is remarkable, right? So what's he negotiating? So in February this year, the 10 core cities went to meet Michel Barnier ourselves. No government sanction, we just went to meet him to say, well, what could we do? And that's the lines we need to pursue. Whatever our national governments are saying, we need to work as international networks, saying how can we work together for our own interest, particularly where our populations cross our city boundaries.
There's time literally for one very quick question. I can't see anybody because these lights. So if somebody could flash a torch at me 3 times. Can I see? Do I see a hand? There's one hand here. I think a mic is, just await the mic. And a short, sharp question,
yes,
if you will.
I come from Colombia, from a developing country. And I think that there's a very interesting discussion here. You have said we need to put cities in the center of national agendas. We need to put also cities in the international agenda. The World Bank, the IDB.
It's a question.
The question is, please, if you could let us know, how can we put cities in the international agenda? That would be the question.
Michael?
Well, I think he's right that the global institutions have largely been set up to deal with sovereign governments. And there are some efforts afoot to try to change that. And I think those institutions are changing, but they're big, unwieldy institutions that don't change easily. And so the IDB, which oversees the Inter-American Development Bank, which oversees Latin America, a highly urbanized region, is much better at dealing with cities, Colombian cities and others, than the World Bank is, which has a much more sovereign focus. So I think these are changing, but we're never going to go back to Florence versus Siena, right? I mean, national governments are still going to be an important part of what makes up this landscape. And so how do we integrate? I mean, I respectfully disagree with Marvin a little bit in terms of you can't just go it alone. Ultimately, you're going to have to bring the national government along. I know that's not what you meant, but we are going to have to find that balance between urban and rural and take it from there.
I also think that, these institutions that have existed, while I think they still have a role, I'm not sure that they're serving their role as true international governance like they may have before. And I think that there are new sources and new ways of creating power networks that I think cities can really be at the core of. And so I think, you know, things like this that are bringing people together, I think are going to start creating new kinds of institutions that really do put cities in the center. And I think with all the different networks and information channels and all the rest of it, I think that we're going to find new ways of having kind of global governance that really does look at cities as a very important part of that.
Think of this as an hors d'oeuvre to a larger meal of the opening, and we'll continue. Thank you so much to all of you.